So here's part C, and if we're not clear what to do, it tells us what to do. It says use separation of variables, so they're pretty clear about that. So they give you what we usually call an initial condition, right? At time t equals 0 seconds, the height is 5 feet. And we're going to find an expression for h in terms of t. So the fact that they told us to use separation of variables, that really just tells us what to do. So here's our expression for the derivative, right? We had dh dt equals -1/10 square root of h. So I just rewrote that with the square root as a 1/2 power. And then we'll go ahead and separate the variables. So that means that we want to bring the h over to this side and the dt over to that side. So we're going to say h to the -1/2 dh equals -1/10 dt, right? So if I divide both sides by h to the 1/2, I'm going to have h to the -1/2 on this side. So you could do 1/square root of h if you wanted, but I figured since we're going to integrate, let's just keep everything in terms of rational exponents. So if I do the antiderivative of h to the -1/2, it's not too hard to figure out that that's 2h to the 1/2, right? I just do antiderivative now. Remember that if I do the antiderivative of -1/10, it's going to be -1/10 t. And as soon as I've done the antiderivative on both sides, that's where I want to put the plus c on. Now, you can also solve for the c at various points during the problem, depending on your preference. I think in general, it's going to be helpful to solve for the c as soon as it shows up. So when that plus c shows up, let's just use the fact that h of 0 equals 5. So that means t equals 0 when h is equal to 5. And let's use that to solve for c. Since h of 0 equals 5, that tells me that my 2h to the 1/2 power is going to be 2 square root 5, and that has to equal -1/10 t, so that's -1/10 times my t is 0, so times 0, and then plus c. And then, so it's pretty clear from this that c equals 2 square root 5, and then I can just put that right back in here and have 2h to the 1/2 equals -1/10 t plus 2 square root 5. Now, varying problems could have different requirements as to whether you solve for the h or not. This problem specifically says for h in terms of t. That means we have to solve for the h. So we don't necessarily have to just by nature of the problem, but since they explicitly told us to, let's divide both sides by 2. So then I have h to the 1/2 power equals -1/20 t plus square root 5. That's just dividing by 2. And then I square both sides and get h equals, and we won't bother to work that out. We'll just leave it in parentheses, -1/20 t plus square root 5. Now I have solved for h, so I have an expression for h in terms of t. I don't need to square this out or do any other further work. I can just leave it like that, and I've done what they've asked. I have used separation of variables to find an expression for h in terms of t.